Hey folks, Steve here with a special review video for you today. We're going to be reviewing Joe Balkowski's The Korean War, published by Compass Games, this being the designer's signature edition of the game. I have played the full campaign plus a playthrough of some of the smaller scenarios. So this review will be based on that. Played Solitaire, like a number of my game reviews. And just a little bit of context for this game, if you're unfamiliar, this is the designer signature edition, so it's an overhaul reprint of the original game that came out in 1986. This is sort of known as like a classic game on the Korean War. It's a strategic operational game, so there are operational aspects, but there's also geopolitical strategic elements as well. If you would like to see a more in-depth run through of me playing the game, you can watch the previous videos. They're on the channel here. There's a lot of detail. There are many long videos. I don't expect you to watch all of them, but if you want to see some of this in action, you can go check those videos out as well. And I'll structure this video like I usually do, where here very shortly we'll go into some more in-depth explanation of how the rules work and how the system works, the mechanics. And then we'll be wrapping up towards the end of the video with my final thoughts, what I think of the game, and all of that goodness. So if you'd like to skip to the closing thoughts and really the main part of like what I thought of the game as the review, the screen will show you the timestamp that you can skip ahead to. If you want to see a more closer, focused conversation on how the game works, then just keep on watching here. I do want to call out as a disclaimer before we go too much farther into the video that when this game was first released, there were a few production issues that were identified by a number of folks, where the counters that came originally with the game, for the folks that had it on pre-order, who got the game first, have very thick counters, with many counter sheets found to have a misalignment issue, where some of the counters were cut off, where the die cut was performed to cut the counters loose for the sheet, which left, in some cases, counters unusable by folks. My game had slight misalignment, and it was not sufficient enough that it impacted the game for me, and I could play the counters as is. They were fine for me, so I did not get a replacement sheet of counters. However, if you're watching this video today and you've purchased the game, it should come with a different set of counters that are more standard thickness, but are not going to have the misalignment problem. So if you buy this game today, you should be in okay shape there. And if you do find that you have counter alignment issues, you can contact Compass Games and they should be able to get you straightened out. If you are buying a copy of this maybe pre-owned, or maybe like secondhand, not direct from Compass Games, and you have those counter issues, reach out to them. They should be able to get you squared away. So this was definitely something that irked a lot of people when the game first came out. I'm lucky to say that I did not have that issue, so I'm playing with my, as is thick counters. That's what I have. I was happy with that. But just beware of that potential issue if you're looking to get the game. Ideally, that's all really taken care of at this point, but something to be aware of. And if you go researching the game, you may see some forum commentary about those issues, but those are now kind of in the past at this point. So yeah, so we'll take a closer look at the game. Again, I've played this now enough that I have a pretty good feel for the game that I can give a review on it. There are a few elements that I'm still not sure I'm a very good player as, say, the communist faction in this game, and that leads me to some concerns maybe about balance, but I think I'm just not playing well. We'll cover that in the final thoughts section. So from here, guys, we'll switch gears to the explanation of mechanics. Again, if you want to switch, or rather skip, to my final thoughts, we'll show you the timestamp for that. Okay, so let's talk about the way that the game works, and I'll try to hit things at a pretty high level. Again, if you want detail, you can watch the game in progress in my other videos. You can also download the rule book from Compass Games and kind of see that the way the way the rules are described. I don't want to dictate the entire rule book to you in this video, but This game is a hex encounter game, so it operates off of units uh, moving through hexes. And because the Korean War as a historical conflict was one that had a lot of these swinging campaigns up and down the Korean Peninsula, the game is really based around managing your efforts to make those movements. And it all comes together pretty well in terms of portraying how breakthroughs could occur and everything else. So I have sort of a mock-up situation here on the map to kind of describe the way that the game functionally works. Now, units on the map are going to range from regiment to division size, and there's a few things that I think should be called out just so you get a frame of reference on how the game actually operates. So on any given counter, so if we take, for example, this Chinese division, and this is basically every unit on the board here on the communist side is either Chinese or it's North Korean. There's a slight shade of color difference where the North Koreans are a little more orange. The Chinese are more of a tan color, while the UN forces, the US, usually is this green color. South Korea is this blue color. And then there's a few other units that have, I don't know how you want to call it, like a lighter blue that represent, maybe this is a good example, lighter blue that represents other allies involved in the UN forces. Excuse me. So on any given counter, you're going to see a couple of values. There's a attack value, which is your most left-hand number. There's a defense value, which is the number on the right. So you want to make sure you keep that in mind, that it is a defense and attack. And broadly speaking, every unit on the map is going to have stronger attack than defense. It gives just a 1-to-1 advantage to an attacker some of the time anyway, where, on attack, your units are going to be more effective. And then there's a middle number in red, which is the anti-tank value. So in this game, when you're doing a combat, it's not just a combat die roll. There's sometimes, if there is armor present, an armor subsequence where you will roll a die. It's almost a combat within a combat that will then dictate what die roll modifier you'll have to the final combat die roll. So that number ends up becoming important in several places as you play the game. And then one important thing is the backside of the unit counters do not reflect step losses. They actually represent when a unit has taken its action and is fatigued or considered fatigued. And you can see the fatigued side of this counter is much weaker. Its attack is only a 6, its defense is only a 4, which creates this circumstance where usually if you can force your opponent to go sort of first or to make some attack and his units are fatigued, that you may be able to counterattack with fresh units and be advantaged. So it's something important, right? If this unit here tried to attack this unit while fatigued, they're going to have a much greater chance of success than if this unit was on its fresh side. So something in terms of the tactical strategy of the game when you're doing your operations, something that is important. The other thing is with this is because the flip side is not an actual step loss, it's representing that fatigued. Step losses are represented by wholly different counters, which kind of lends itself to a larger number of counters in total. And in many cases, counters you may not ever use because you just never end up needing to. So if this unit took a step loss, which is part of the combat results, you can have 1 to 2 or 3 step losses, including retreats. If this unit took a step loss, we would instead have a replacement counter. So just by way of example, I'm going to replace that. And so you might be able to see, you might have to look carefully, but there are units that say RPL and 2 stars. That means it's a replacement 2-step unit. If a division takes a step loss, it gets replaced with this unit, and it is much weaker, only a 6-4, which is as strong as the unit was fatigued. So the unit fresh is as weak as a fatigued full unit. If this unit takes 1 step loss, then it will go down to an RPL 1-star unit, which is even weaker at a 3-1-3 unfatigued. And then you can imagine if fatigued, it's even even weaker. So when you start taking attrition losses due to combats, just something to know that you will use wholly separate counters in this game. Now, there are ways for weakened units, if you have a collection of replacement units nearby, that they can amalgamate. That's the term the game uses, which is a great word choice. Amalgamate those units to become a coherent division again. So let's say this unit had been reduced. Maybe it's reduced down to a one-step unit. If we were able to get a 2-star replacement unit nearby, they could amalgamate and we could see a restored full strength unit. But the way that the reinforcements work in this game is, for the communists, largely speaking, if you're doing amalgamation, all you're really doing is moving steps around rather than being able to replenish weakened units. But by and large, I think you would rather have, just by way of an example here, you'd much rather have a full strength division than these two separate units split up. Combined, the attack is 9. Combined, their defense is 7, which might be maybe better in some perspective, but they can't stack. So the stacking in this game is basically 3 regiments in a hex or 1 division, and if that division is reduced down to an RPL 1 or 2 unit, that's the only unit that can be in the hex. Not counting things like armor, which we'll talk about here in a second, by way of example, this North Korean unit. So they can amalgamate, get stronger, and the game tends to represent a full-strength division to be greater than the sum of its parts, usually. And though this is even more important for the UN forces. In this game, the UN will have, and speaking specifically to US divisions, you'll have a unit like this, which is a full-strength US division. You can see a full-strength South Korean division by comparison. So both are divisions, both count for the same for stacking. The South Korean has an attack of 10, defense of 6, anti-tank of 4 there in the middle, but the US unit is 20 on attack, 11 on defense, 6 anti-tank. Very potent. But similarly, when that unit is going to take a step loss, it gets a replacement counter. So we'd go down to 10-4-7, or at a 1-step, a 5-2-4. So that can be a bit challenging. The one thing that the UN forces have, particularly the US units, is that they do not amalgamate, but basically, assuming that this unit went a whole action phase, which we'll talk about here shortly, how the turn is divided up, if that unit took a step loss and was at, say, 10-4-7, it did nothing for an action phase, there's something called a UN reconstitution step, which means they get a free step replenishment back up to full strength. And it's actually one of the principal advantages of the UN forces in this game is that they can take hits. Given enough time to recuperate, they can replenish. So the communist needs to try to create situations where the UN units don't have very good opportunities to replenish, or assuming they get replenished off map, that they have a harder time getting back into a good advantageous position. The other thing that the UN forces have is the ability to divide themselves and then combine units. So by way of example, I've got these 3 US regiments here. They're 4-2-3s by themselves, but what you can do is you can stack these guys together. 3 regiments can then, as an action, be replaced with a full-strength division. So replacing, and now we've got a division. Now, why you're going to want to do that, just again explaining the concept of greater than the sum of its parts. If you were to look at 3 regiments all stacked together, they have a combined attack strength of 12, which is far less than the actually fully combined reorganized unit, that is the division, with an attack strength of 20. And this kind of represents a massing of all the artillery and support that each regiment would have, and then a division is assumed to have a greater sort of headquarter leadership component within that unit that gives the additional bonuses. So where you can in this game, it is better to have a full strength division. You may split up, choose to replace this guy with 3 regiments because you need to spread out to cover Zox or maybe to quickly capture some territory. But generally speaking, having a division is better. So much so, in fact, that if you wanted to compare this then to, what does this look like for the replacement units of a full division, you can see that even a single step division remnant of a 524 is stronger than an individual regiment. So something to keep in mind, the remnant division still stronger than the regiment. And even that applies for the 2-step is still greater than 2 regiments together. So you can kind of see just that ability to say, hey, this is a division, even one that has been weakened over time, still has greater firepower and defense than the subdivided regiments there in the game situation. So something to keep in mind in terms of how that works. I mentioned the armor, so certainly there are armor units here. They have an armor value, and then they also have an anti-tank value. And how that will work is when you're doing a combat, and let's say we're here, this unit, which has an asset, that's the way it works. These assets don't operate alone. They are attached to an existing unit. Say we're going to, attack here to here. Well, what we would do is we'd count up our armor, which would be 9 armor factors. We would compare it to the defender's anti-tank value. In this case, it's 3, so 9 to 3 is 3 to 1. There's a specific combat table that is used for armor. And just to quickly show what that looks like, so you would be on the 3 to 1, and you'd roll a die. There are a few modifiers for terrain and a few other things. And then this tells you, do you get a bonus to your combat, or does this armor unit take a step loss? And different from combat units, assets can have a step loss. So that represents the armor actually taking that step. They now have fewer armor factors and anti-tank factors, or tank factors and anti-tank factors situated there. So that bonus then means that they're going to be able to do better on the die roll. And I found that in the combat system for this game, generally modifiers tend to be better than increasing your odds. So it is good to get good odds, but generally modifiers are going to be the best thing that keeps you from taking step losses yourself on attack. Those combat modifiers, when it comes to attack, are going to come from things like terrain, attacking over rivers. These are straightforward things. There's also the close air support bonuses, which we'll talk about the air system here in just a minute or two. But all of those things will factor in to your combat die roll, which is done with the D10, and can result in either the attacker taking step losses or the defender taking step losses. In this game system, you're not going to run into a situation where both sides will take a step loss unless the communist player is using the Chinese wave attacks, which I don't want to go super in depth on that. It's just basically when a full Chinese division is attacking, they can choose to get a bonus +1 die roll modifier, but it may mean that they're going to take a step loss in addition to whatever else occurs on the combat die roll. So just trying to use their numbers to overrun the enemy and get some bonus, but they're basically paying in step losses for that. That's generally how the combat is going to go, but how you actually take your actions in an action phase is such that basically each side will go back and forth rolling a die. Depending on their die roll and on their initiative table, it will tell you how many units you can activate before it's your opponent's turn to activate some units. So you may activate 1 unit, you may get to activate 3 units, and that can obviously change what you can do before your enemy has a chance to respond. What's nice is this is not a game where you have all your units go and then your opponent gets to all go, or you have some sort of arbitrary response move with a handful of units. It is simply you don't know how many units you'll get to actually operate with right this second until you roll the die, and then you do that. And it could mean that your opponent can't respond very effectively because of his own supply in an initiative situation, and you go back and forth activating units. When a unit is done being activated, that's when it flips to that fatigued side. Now, how all of this comes together in terms of operating in that initiative is your supply. Now, the supply doesn't really start affecting the game until after the first couple of turns, but once it does, each player is going to be placing depots. So here's an example down here for the communists, and then we'll sort of arbitrarily put one here for the UN force. So you place these depots. Then what you're going to do is you're going to look at where the depot was placed, what province on the map, because they are separated by these sort of, I don't know what you want to call it, dotted line type borders. You cross-reference that on a chart. In your own territory, it tends to be better. If that depot for the UN can trace to Pusan, that's better. You will roll a die, and that will tell you how many supply points you get. So let's say we had 2 supply points. Then you need to decide how many of these are you going to spend for activities. And you can choose, if I got 2 here, to spend only 1 and bank the extra 1, so that on a later turn, if I didn't roll as well and I only got the 1 supply point, I could effectively use that saved supply point to help my commitment levels. So when you spend the supply, depending on how much supply you spend, you're going to get a different level of commitment. So in this case, if we spent 2, we would get an accelerated commitment marker, and we'd put that on the depot. And this changes the combat value of the units that are on the board and within a certain amount of range. So there's a concept of primary and secondary range. If you're within 12 movement points of the depot, that's primary range. If you're between, I think it's 12 and 25, your secondary range, and anything beyond that, or if you're isolated, then you're just totally out of range. And depending on the level of commitment you're at, that may mean that your units are maybe double what is printed on their counter. So a 20 becomes a 40, or might be 1.5, where a 20 becomes a 40 if doubled, or a 30 if you get a 1.5 bonus. Or if you're in a bad situation and your commitment is low, or you have trouble tracing back to your depot, then these units could be halved, even quartered. So you could very easily destroy even a full strength division that is isolated, has quartered defense strength, and has nowhere to retreat to. That's how you completely wipe out divisions, and that can be a very potent thing to achieve in the game itself. So as you're playing the game, what you're focusing on is, where am I putting my depots? Where can I get the best odds of getting high supply? And then I can pick, am I going to do a limited activity and save up supply to do a more focused commitment, an accelerated commitment, or an offensive commitment? And that's what you need to be able to do double combat strength on attack, which is just very, very potent in this game. So that's sort of the main operations, right? And then depending on the level of commitments that you have, how many supply points you spent, that's going to determine who has initiative during the action phases. And if there's a tie, the communists get the tie. So it's something to keep in mind there. So all of that is how you operate for combat. When you actually go to activate a unit, you're usually going to get 3 action points. I think it's on like turn 1. The North Koreans only get like 2 action points. But the important thing is, you can choose to do a number of different things with those points. And movement and combat are a function of each other, basically. They're using the same action economy. So you could have a unit do nothing but movement, and they can move 12 movement points of movement. Pretty good. They get pretty far, especially on roads, which are only half a movement point cost. So you could get, if you're way back here, you get way down here very, very quickly. However, you could instead spend 1 action point to do up to 4 movement points. So there's action points, there's movement points. You got to kind of watch how you look at that. You spend 1 action point, get 4 movement points. Move a little bit, and then you've still got 2 action points left. Then you could spend the rest of those action points doing an attack. And if you're spending 2 action points for an attack, you actually get a bonus that's considered an intensive attack. and you get a +2 to your die roll. If you didn't move at all and you decided to use all your action points on the attack, then you get an all-out attack, which is a +3 to the die roll, which can be very powerful, very helpful when you're doing combat. Alternatively, and I think the game situation just depends on what you're trying to achieve, you could do, spend one action point, do a combat, spend your second action point to do, let's just say we did combat here and we managed to repulse or destroy this 2-step unit. Advance after combat. We use our second, let's say this guy doesn't exist for a second. We use our second action point for a second combat, knock this guy out, and then we could use our third action point for movement and do something like, leaving a Zoc actually cost a number of movement points. We could move over here. And then maybe we were activating a second unit after that, and, somebody is, I don't know, advancing very far up the way behind us and, is moved up like that. So you have some flexibility. And what's interesting is that there, in some games it might be you move and then you do combat, and if you do combat, you're done. Instead, you could do movement, combat, movement. You could do combat, movement, combat. You could do just one of those actions, but again, you get a lot more bang for your buck. So if you used all your action points for movement, again, you could move 12 movement. You could do an all-out attack and get a big bonus, or you could be splitting the difference. And I think knowing how to best use those action points will be who proves to be the better player and the operations aspect, right? Are you going to maybe have less likelihood of succeeding in that first attack, but if you do well on it, that means you can do a greater exploit. And I do like that. I like games that allow you to make that sort of very mobile warfare decision making of, am I going to focus on a heavy attack and exhaust my guys just doing that? Or is it more of a probing attack, and if we can force the enemy back, we can continue to exploit that? The system works pretty well for that. It is interesting, those decisions. And knowing that you're maybe only getting to activate one unit may mean you do less than if you were able to activate 3 units before your enemy could respond. Maybe you're doing an all-out attack with one unit, then the other unit is exploiting the gap made by that first unit. You have a lot of options that come into play in your decision making for all of that. In terms of the geopolitical stuff, I will just say, I'll cover this very briefly because I think this is like the strategic element that plays into the game. The UN player has to decide their level of commitment in the game, and that is represented by 3 different types of things. It can feel a little complicated. The game does give you an opportunity to play the historical style, which is what I did in my campaign, where I let the game just tell me how to escalate my intervention as the US. But if you're playing an open game, you can decide how aggressive do you want your rules of engagement? How high do you want to be mobilizing? How much do you want to intervene in terms of sending forces from nearby countries or the US into the Korean Peninsula? And all of that has costs and opportunities associated with it. So sure, you could intervene in high value. You'll get more units. You will get better ability to impact the North Korean supply situation. But the cost is much greater likelihood to increase the global tension. And global tension is something that is tracked turn to turn and will affect when the Chinese will intervene, just depending on where you're at on the map. That will determine if the Chinese intervene. It can also affect, I got to be careful because there's not a direct relationship between Chinese intervening and global tension. It's really about how the UN intervenes. But all of that kind of comes together in the decision space, where if the Chinese are intervening and they're doing very well, do you need to increase your escalation? But that will increase the tension. Now, if you have too much global tension, the game can end in World War III, thermonuclear war, and that's considered a communist victory. But even if global tension increases over time, that will negatively affect the UN's ability to win the game via victory points. So we should talk about how you win. If you're playing the smaller scenarios, there are specific victory conditions there. There's different ways to count, victory points for the tactical situation that you're playing through, usually involving destroying units or whatever, and capturing territory. In a campaign game, it is broadly usually going to come down to victory points. There's a few auto victory situations that can come up based on controlled territory, like the communists taking control of Busan or the UN forces capturing several cities in the northern reaches of North Korea. But it will usually be victory points. And important cities on the map, like Seoul and these sort of areas here, have these sort of icons with numbers in them. So Seoul says 4, Yongdongpao is 1, Incheon is 2. Well, these are victory points. So if the UN player controls them, they count victory points. And so you see here, it's like 7 is right here in this little cluster. There are other places on the map that are worth victory points, and the UN player needs to reach certain thresholds to be the victor at the end of the game. Because you count them every turn, it matters every turn where you're at. So there's always this driver for the UN player to reclaim lost territory and to be making that decision. Do they advance beyond the 8th parallel to capture North Korean territory to get victory points? As global tension increases, that will be a penalty to your victory point accrual. So if you're lucky and global tension remains low, you may not need to capture as much territory to win. But if global tension is increasing, then you're going to have this greater need to capture more territory or to hold more territory over the course of the game. And that is the crux of the geopolitical aspect of this game, why this game is a strategic level game in addition to being an operational level game, because you're making decisions around how to balance that. How much should the UN be intervening right now to offset the impact of global tension? And so even if you're getting more units by intervening at a greater level, it may mean that you have to actually make use of that stuff and be more aggressive. So it's really interesting to me how that kind of comes together, that decision-making process. I think it makes for interesting game decisions where, for me, I was trying to play more historically because I wanted to see how well the game captured what happened. But if you are playing this game a lot, then I could certainly see where you're playing with a buddy and you guys have played before, playing around with the intervention levels and seeing how all of that works together. To look holistically at what a whole turn looks like, there is a political phase where the UN player is going to adjust their commitment. You're going to look at the global tension levels and roll some dice for that. You're going to deal with the air stuff then, which I'm going to transition our camera. We're going to fly over Korea up to where we have our air display. And just to quickly show, there's this province map. Now, the UN player gets air units, and I'm sorry for the glare, guys. You're going to have to deal with that for just a moment. The UN player is going to get air units. The North Korean, the communists, will not get any air units at all. At the beginning of the game, they do get a few free close air support points that they can use in their initial attacks on South Korea, but by and large, it's going to be the UN player. And you get different air units and your reinforcements. Here, these are B-29 bombers, so they're going to be used to do interdiction, which affect supply. So to summarize the way the system works, you're going to pick locations where you're going to put your bombers, and they have different modifiers. So here's a ×5, so you count up all the interdiction value on your plane, and then you add up all that together, and that will affect the interdiction level. You'll roll some dice. That will determine the penalties to the communist players' supply die rolls. There's a lot of die rolling and a lot of chart references in this game, and I will say that it felt like a lot at first, but as I got used to the system and sort of the procedure, I got through it a couple of times, it got a lot easier. Otherwise, you may have other plane types, like these guys, that they can do interdiction, which is the second number on the counter, but they're more likely going to be doing close air support, which is the first number on the counter. And you'll assign them differently. They will be assigned to do close air support, and what that will basically mean is you'll add up all the units that are doing close air support. That will give you a close air support level, which you'll use this track for. And then that will be the amount of bonuses that the UN player has for an entire turn to affect combats. They can always do up to 2 in any given combat, so they can make it a +2 to their die roll in addition to other modifiers, or they can make it a -2 to the Koreans, or the North Koreans or the Chinese when they're attacking UN forces. So it's really, one-sided for the UN, but it's about how they apply these bonuses to do different things. If they have 4 units in a province, what they can do is put restricted road movement in that province, which means that you're going to not allow the communist player to get the movement bonus on roads the same as they would if they were not interdicted there. So the decision making for interdiction may come down to how much do you want to impact their supply, and sometimes, depending on the number of air units you have to use at any given turn, do you want to affect their movement? And sometimes you can do both and do both well. Sometimes you have to make a decision, which would you rather impact? So all of that comes together, again, affecting how these units have their supply affected, whether or not they're going to get good supply, limited commitment, or accelerated commitment. There's amphibious capacity steps where you determine how much amphibious capacity does the UN player have. They're going to use those for either amphibious evacuations or amphibious invasions to represent like the Incheon invasion that kind of flipped the campaign progress. In reality, you're going to do similar types of things here in this game. I'm not going to go super deep into it because you're only going to do it a few times in the game, but basically, your units will come on, they'll attack or walk into the space if it's empty, they'll land, you'll put a beachhead marker to get some minimal supply, and they'll be able to operate from there. It's a pretty straightforward process, nothing too complicated. Then you get into the action phases. There are 2 action phases per turn. They all run the same. You're going to check for reinforcements. UN reinforcements will be based on your intervention, and then North Korean and South Korean reinforcements will be dependent on some die rolls with a few modifiers based on controlled territory. Chinese intervention will be based on some game situation stuff to depend on if they intervene at all. And then once they do, Chinese reinforcements actually have to come onto the board during the actual operations phase of an action phase, where you're spending your activations to bring them onto the map and move them down. Once you've done reinforcements, you're going to do the deployment of your depots. You're going to do all that die rolling to determine the level of commitment, and then that's when you start rolling the die to determine how many units will activate, and you start playing through the operations segment, moving and attacking and doing all that until both players are, they've fatigued all their units or they've passed. Both players have passed. Then you're going to move on to a few other cleanup steps. So reassigning assets. So typically, if you needed to move an asset, the asset's going to go to a depot, and then later you'll reassignment to a different unit. You're going to get the UN reconstitution segment, which is that healing a step loss that I mentioned before, but only if that unit is unfatigued, it didn't take any action during the turn. And then all the fatigue units will flip to their unfatigued sides, and you basically go again in a second action phase. When the second action phase is complete, then you'll have basically a victory point phase where the UN player will count their victory points, and then you start again in a new turn. There are 12 total turns of the campaign game, 5 of which are winter turns, and that's indicated on the turn track. That will determine a couple of things. There's a few die roll modifiers related to winter, but nothing too crazy. And that's kind of it. Now, there's a lot more detail there. This video would be much, much, much longer if I tried to cover every little thing in here. But generally speaking, all these mechanics come together to reflect, again, the geopolitical, strategic elements that influence, that help filter into the overall abilities of both sides to operate, which can impact their supply, which impacts their expenditure of that supply to be able to operate more effectively, which then feeds into the movement in combat, and it all comes together pretty darn well. And you will see, the North Koreans surging over the border, pushing all the way down south, bitter fighting to defend Pusan, and then the ability for the UN to push back, to make a surprise landing somewhere. It doesn't have to be Incheon, you can pick somewhere else. The UN forces moving back up, and then the Chinese intervention will occur, and you'll have a big slugging match. And it does come together pretty well once you get over the chart management and all of that fun stuff. Now, with all of that said, in just pure mechanic explanation, I alluded to a few opinions here. I'm going to wrap things up with my final thoughts and what I thought of the game after playing through all of this. So that's the next segment. We'll see you over there. Okay, so what did I think of the game? Well, I had a really good time with it. I think, I guess before I purchased this game, I had heard people reference the original from the 80s and kind of talk about how it was like the game on the Korean War. And I couldn't, I couldn't validate it. I wasn't sure. I had to play it myself, and I didn't really have an opportunity to get a copy. With the designer's signature edition, that was my opportunity. So I jumped on it, sat on it for a while until I finally got to play it, and I'm really glad that I did. I do think this is a very good game on the subject. Now, I'm not an expert on the Korean War. I've learned a lot along the way of playing this game and others recently to get a better understanding of the history and what was going on. And based on what I know and based on what I've played here, I think this game has the right stuff, so to speak. And I will say, in terms of trying to do a review holistically, the components are a really interesting subject here. So the counters, having had the issue that I mentioned earlier in this video, for me, not a big deal. I know for others, it was a much more difficult thing to deal with. One interesting aspect that I should mention is that the game is blown up from the original. So the counters are bigger. The map is likewise bigger. I had to get two of my longer tables together just to kind of have a good setup for the map, the way that I wanted it, and all the other force pool counters and the player aid sheets and everything together. I had to kind of set up my tables a certain way to accommodate. The map is much bigger than it used to be from the original edition. And for some folks, that's going to pose a problem. Now, it's not a problem for me. And to be truthful, if we were talking about a game that was always very large, like World in Flames or an OCS game, where the maps, if you're going to play the whole thing, take up a lot of space, I wouldn't look at that as a negative for the game. So it seems odd to mention it here, but I know that for folks who had the original that took up a much smaller footprint in terms of your table, this might be a bummer to look at now the souped up designer signature edition, and it is a much bigger game. That could be seen as a problem. For me, I have a luxury of space, so it wasn't a big deal to me. But know that if you're going to play the whole shebang, it is going to take up some table space. That could be an issue for you. You can play some of the smaller scenarios, the non-campaign scenarios, with a much smaller footprint. And in fact, the player aids were designed and set up that anything that's on the tables that are on the map that would not be available to you because you're playing with only one of the several maps that come with the game that fit together, can be used on a player aid sheet. So the game does support you not having to set up every single map. If you're playing the campaign game and you do expect to use the whole map, then you are a little more limited. You're going to have to set it up or figure out some other way of, like, as the front moves, you can put a map away and slide everything around on your table or something. That's a little bit more difficult, I think, in my mind to achieve. So just something to watch out for. Besides that, I will say that the map art, I don't like as much as other games that cover this subject. I think there are other games that have much nicer looking maps. The clear terrain, though I got used to it, is this shade of like gray blue that almost makes it seem like it's a floodplain, like just in terms of what it looks like to my eyes. The rest of the rough terrain, broken terrain, mountain terrain is all fine and serviceable. I do wish that the map was just a little more, I don't know, attractive. That's a very subjective term. But the map is serviceable. I think it could have been better, but it is serviceable in terms of just the aesthetic. The player aids are very good. I do think the player aids are well put together. You get plenty of them, so both players should not have any want for being able to look at different tables. And in fact, if you were playing this with like 3 or 4 people and you were somehow dividing up the labor playing a side, though I'm not sure how realistic that is because I don't think there's that much going on the map at any time. Each player has enough things at their disposal that they can see the right charts, they can do the right things. So it feels like, in terms of just utility to the game player, you get a lot of the charts, you have a lot at your fingertips, you're not wanting for anything there. Everything is easily well provided on the player aid sheets that come with the game. So that much was good. So the components to me come out to be pretty solid. Again, the aesthetic of the map aside, you get everything you need to play the game pretty well in my mind. So that was good. And hitting the gameplay, again, I touched on this a little bit in the gameplay mechanics explanation earlier in the video, but I think the game comes together quite well. The intermingling of the decision space of intervention and the global tension and the pros and cons, and that there is a legitimate conversation you could have with yourself or with your partner if you're playing this like 2 and 2 of, well, do we ratchet up intervention? Do we have the UN come in with greater force? The problem will be a greater amount of tension, potentially, which means we're going to have to be more aggressive. So if we want more units, we're going to have to be more aggressive. That means heading up further into North Korea than maybe we would need to otherwise. If global tension is higher, in a weird way, that means you're going to have to go further up, and that may put you at greater risk of being mauled by the Chinese communists when Chinese forces intervene. Now, in my game experience that I had, I did not have a situation where the UN forces were caught badly by Chinese intervention. I think largely that was because the tension, I got super lucky on the die rolls, and because I was using historical intervention, we didn't have a lot of global tension, which meant I didn't have this need to go deeply into North Korea. And so, that was just part of my decision. I didn't have to worry about it very much. The other thing was that the Chinese intervention happened pretty early. And so, and it actually happened before the UN had even crossed the 38th parallel again. And what that meant was that the bonuses that the Chinese communists get when they enter was such that they didn't surprise UN force. They didn't get a lot of these great punches in that would have required, or what historically kind of happened, where the UN were really beaten up badly and had to retreat with the onslaught and surprise of the Chinese intervention. That just didn't happen in my game. I think some of it has to do with me not knowing the right way to play the communists. So I have a little bit of a concern on play balance, where the UN is the master of modifiers. And in this combat system, it seems like modifiers are the best thing. The close air support, the naval support, the very high likelihood that they're going to have an armor advantage against the communist forces means that generally they can reduce communist die roll modifiers or have very strong modifiers themselves. And that just is great for them. I mean, I just had so many combats where it was like, we're just smashing the communists, or maybe the communists are going to get lucky with this die roll, but the counterattacks by the UN are just going to be so good because I marshaled my close air support very carefully. I used my armor very carefully to always ensure that we were getting very good die roll modifiers. So I'm not sure tactically the right way to address that as the communist. I think maybe it's they have to be doing all-out attacks, and then they have to be doing the Chinese wave, to be pretty good, and then they kind of have to rely on luck or the multiple attempts of successive units attacking to kind of wear down the UN. If they are fortunate and they get to do their early surprise attacks in favorable terrain in the far north of Korea, and get like the historical results, then they're going to do pretty well later as they move down the peninsula. But if they don't, right, if the UN forces are not too far north and they can't isolate and attack the UN forces, it feels like it's really hard for the communists to make any progress. Now that's what happened in my campaign, and I wonder if there's some other way I could have done better. And so I kind of chalk it up to my own inability to do well as the communists, but I'm a little worried, like, I need someone to show me how do you perform well late game as the communists. Some of it has to do with the strategic situation. So again, if the communists are coming in and the Chinese communists are intervening and they're coming down the peninsula, but the UN has not had to venture very far north because the tension has been low, then what's the strategy there? And I think maybe it's what my mistake was not letting the communists sort of come onto the map and slowly come down together. I did this sort of piecemeal wave attacks, and they just crashed upon the wall of the UN, and that's a misplay on my part. So there's some element here, there's some part of me that wants to say maybe there's a balance concern, but I think that's just bad play on my part. And if I was playing this game more and more and more, I would get better and better and better. Where, again, like, it's the game situation. You have to know the game situation. If the UN is not having to deal with a lot of tension, then they're not going to need to go as far into North Korea. And that means when the Chinese do come onto the board, you have to approach it differently than you would if global tension was much higher and the UN had to be up far in North Korea to get those victory points that they desperately need. And you're going to have an easier time jumping on them and hurting them. So there's some element of that. And I can't say that I'm the master of it. I didn't unlock all the keys of strategy in my playthrough, but I genuinely had a really good time playing it and just kind of playing it out and seeing what was happening. All of the systems make sense with each other, so the gameplay is definitely sound. The rules, I would say, are pretty well written in terms of understanding how you're going to play the game, how you're going to learn the game. The rules are all pretty darn clear throughout. I could maybe see a couple of situations where it might have been better to put some paragraphs and some sections and other chapters of the rule book or whatever, but it was pretty darn good. So this is already a very long video. I want to kind of wrap things up to say I think this is a rock solid game on the Korean War. It is absolutely deserving of its praise as sort of a classic game. Now, this Designer Signature Edition has included a few refinements and changes that weren't in the original. There are some differences, but generally, as far as I can tell, they're fine. They're good. Maybe for someone who's not played the original, it won't make a difference. I did not play the original, so it's a little harder for me to say. But if you're just a new person of a hobby or something, or you've never played a game on the Korean War and you're looking for a game on the Korean War, by gosh, buy The Korean War by Joe Balkowski, published by Compass Games. I think it is a rock-solid, good game on the subject. I do see it as a good definitive game that encompasses the operational aspects, the geopolitical, strategic aspects, and it all comes together pretty darn well. If you're the communist player, though, you may want to think very carefully about how to properly use your forces to achieve victory, where I feel like maybe I did not do that, and I just like playing the UN and getting to use air power and armor is just a lot more, easier to see how to, proceed, I guess. Communist needs a little bit more careful thought, maybe. But otherwise, awesome game, guys. So I do recommend it. I do recommend you get the Designer Signature Edition if you can. Again, if you have any issues with your counters, contact Compass. They should be able to take care of that for you. But yeah, it was good. I'm glad that I purchased the game. And, I think there's a whole conversation to be had comparing this game with other games that cover the same conflict. Thinking like Korea Fire and Ice, also published by Compass Games. I may want to do a comparison video to kind of, help you decide like why you might buy one or the other. But genuinely, I have no reservations about saying that this is a great game. Definitely give it a shot if you are interested. If you have other thoughts on this or you have criticism of the game, I mean, those might be fair, but I think that the pros definitely outweigh any cons as it relates to this product. So let me know what you think down in the comment section below. I hope that helps you understand the value of the game. If this is something that is worthwhile for you to check out, you can still order from Compass Games. I believe as of today in September 2022, it is still in stock, so you should still be able to get it. I have no idea if they're going to look to reprint it again, so definitely your opportunity to pick it up is now. So thanks for watching, guys. I hope this video was valuable for you. If you like the video, hit like. If you've not subscribed to me, hit the subscribe button. Otherwise, we'll see you in another video. So thanks for watching. Keep on gaming.